Welcome to the lecture for Psych 350. We'll be talking about research relevant to the cognitive approach to understanding personality. Talk about just a couple of things today about aggression, about memory, and about depression. Starting off talking about aggression, the general aggression model is a cognitive model for understanding and explaining why and when aggression happens, and is used to predict who might be aggressive and when they might be aggressive. And for the general aggression model, it supposes that aggressive actions occur, because of a combination of who a person is and what situation they're in. But this kind of person-situation combo only results in aggression to the extent that that combination influences that person's thinking, right? And so one of the things we talk about in terms of how it influences their thinking is the activation of their cognitive network of hostile cognitions. And research supports that people who are frequently aggressive, habitually aggressive, have more well-developed schema regarding aggression. So they have, just like we talked before about how your schema for taking a test is more well-developed than your schema for flying a plane. If you're very aggressive, then you have a well-developed schema for aggression. Lots of different ways of thinking about aggression, different ways of being able to picture how to be aggressive. Just a lot more information there and more well-organized than somebody who's less aggressive. So because of their hostile thoughts and feelings, they're more likely... because the schema is so well developed, their hostile thoughts and feelings are more likely to be activated by a wider array of situational stimuli. Right? Since it's so well developed, it takes less of kind of a situational input. Certain situations call for aggression seemingly more than others. Like somebody, you're on the plane and somebody's wheeling their bag down and they roll their little wheelie bag over your foot. Probably not, most people think, a call for aggression there. But somebody who has a well-developed schema for aggression might think, oh, this person's trying to get me, and they might get pissed off and at least give them a dirty look, or maybe kick their bag, something. Other situations, somebody punches you in the face and says that your mother's a goat. Most people would agree that that's a stronger situational pull for aggression, right? So regardless of how well developed your schema is, probably going to have an aggressive response there. But again, the more well developed your schema is, with less of a situational input, you'll still see some aggression. Okay. So in addition to these kind of cognitive networks of hostile cognitions, lots of ways of thinking about hostility and aggression and violence. Aggressive individuals are also thought to have learned certain behavior patterns or scripts. That's all these scripts are. They're patterns of behavior associated with aggression. And those scripts that are more often practiced are more likely to be employed. So aggressive people who spend time imagining getting into a fight, or even you see them maybe shadow boxing, or enacting violence in kind of pantomime. They're working on their scripts, and they're not doing it like, okay, I gotta get ready for a fight. It's just how they seem to be for other reasons, which are kind of beyond our discussion for now. But the idea that the more they imagine and the more they practice these scripts, the more likely they are to engage in the behavior later, which should be reminiscent of stuff we've talked about before with Bandura, right? So they have these behavioral patterns that they've learned, either because they've done them before, they've seen them performed. And there also is a role in the general aggression model for the influence of cognitive priming, and this has to do with viewing or listening to, being exposed to violent stimuli, and that can be pictures, words, whatever. It seems to prime hostile cognitions. It makes aggression more likely. And priming, kind of like priming a pump. Try to get the water out of the pump, you got to put some water in first, and it gets it going. Right? There's this cognitive priming effect, which there's lots of other research on, that suggests that words or images, stimuli that we experience, are usually connected to other pieces of information in cognitive networks in our minds. Right? So thinking about one thing in the network makes other things in the network more accessible. Right? And this is why when you're trying to remember a name, you start saying names out loud that start with a letter. You think the to be remembered name starts with. So like, oh, what was it Tina, Tanya, oh, Terry, that's what it was, Terry, right? That's because there's this kind of, you can imagine a cognitive network of all the names you've ever heard before, and probably all the names that begin with a T are close together in the network, and more different names are more distal in the network. So go Tanya, Terry, you're not going to go, oh yeah, Zachary, that's what it was. No, that's a different area. But because you intuitively know from experience that kind of thinking about things related to what you're trying to remember makes it easy to remember that thing you're searching for. That reflects the idea of these cognitive networks and the priming effect. That, again, activating related ideas can activate other ideas. So same thing with aggression. And this may explain why sometimes when people see aggression and then they go and act it out, they don't do exactly what they saw, right? So it's not just that they're imitating, but seeing aggression might prime their network of aggressive thoughts. Okay, I saw somebody kicking something, and that's related to my ideas about punching, so now I'm going to go out and punch instead of kick, because that got activated as well. And cognitive theorists also talk about the influence of these this kind of way of thinking about hostility and aggression, in terms of people who are really aggressive tend to interpret things in line with their schema, right? So once hostile cognitions are activated, it influences the way all other stimuli are perceived. And even just going back to the idea of these kind of cognitive networks, these schema that are well developed, because they're so well developed, it's easier to process information related to aggression. So they're more likely to interpret some event that might be ambiguous. Well, I'm not sure if it was an accident they kind of fell against me, or if they were trying to shove me. Somebody who's very aggressive is more likely to make an interpretation that related to hostility. Right? They're more likely to see hostile things. Okay, so the one of the areas where much of the research on the general aggression model and the kind of the cognitive approach to looking at aggression, a lot of it's focused on boys who exhibit aggression, because they're the ones that are causing problems in schools, really more so than girls. So it's boys. Boys who exhibit aggression, and specifically aggression in response to perceived threats or slights, so reactive aggression. So not kind of sadistic aggression where nobody pushed the kid, nobody did anything, the kid just goes out and knocks the crap out of somebody or sets something on fire. Not that, but kids that somebody says one little thing or may shoves them a little, and they have a larger than appropriate reaction, usually more aggressive, more violent reaction than appropriate. So what do we know about these kids? That in line with what we talked about, they do their perception of hostility is different. They perceive more aggressive cues than non-aggressive kids. So ambiguous stimuli, they're more likely to see it as aggressive. And also, whenever there are kind of subtle aggressive cues where somebody really is trying to, we'll have a Confederate really do something that's kind of mean, but it's very subtle and kind of sneaky. These aggressive kids, they not only see stuff that isn't really aggression, but they actually are better at seeing aggression than non-aggressive kids. Non-aggressive kids might miss out that somebody's trying to get at them, but these kids, they're looking for it, and so they're more likely to see it when it's there, and also when maybe it's not there, when it's more ambiguous, they're more likely to perceive hostility. But the good news is that we can change behavior patterns by targeting their cognition. So interventions that have been aimed at teaching kids not only new behaviors, which is part of it, but also teaching them cognitive skills, appraisal skills. Okay, when things like this happen, you have a choice. You can think that it means this, or it might mean this. Right? Teaching that cognitive flexibility about how to interpret events in the world, and that they don't always have to be interpreted in terms of this kind of hostile, aggressive schema. Those interventions work, and kids that go through these programs tend to not show the increases in aggression that other kids with similar risk factors show. So it can kind of arrest the progression of aggression. Okay. Another area of research that the cognitive approach has looked at is at gender differences, and specifically with the things that men and women remember. Right, and so in general, men and women remember the same amount of stuff, right? There's not one sex that's better at remembering stuff than the other. Until we start looking at different types of stuff, different types of information, right? Because it seems that men and women process information differently, on average, and therefore show differences in memory for certain types of information. One of which would be information related to emotion. Women remember more related to emotions. The last time somebody asked me, what's the last time you were happy? What's the last time you were sad? Easier for a woman to access that information and talk about it. For a man, he may not be able to answer that question, or will certainly have more difficulty. The emotional component of memory is not as strong for men. Why is that? And there might be a biological explanation, but hard to know because there clearly is a role of gender roles here, right? As we grow up, we're rewarded and punished for being consistent with or violating our gender roles. And one of the aspects of gender roles, at least in our culture, is related to talking about emotions, right? And expressing emotions. Boys don't cry, right? How many times have you heard a parent tell that to a boy? How many times do you hear a parent say, "Hey, girls don't cry"? That doesn't sound right. No, because that's not the message we send. So women are rewarded for expressing emotions, and men tend to be punished for expressing their emotions. And that might be why we kind of grow up learning to think differently about emotions, to pay more attention to it for women and pay less attention to it for men, and that affects what we remember. And as we talked about before, information related to the self is usually the easiest to remember, like self-relevant information. And women seem to be more likely to have attended to, recorded, and stored emotional information about themselves than men. So, in terms of about, men and women both experience emotions, but women are more likely to pay attention to their emotions and label their emotions. And because they attend to it and think about it more, it's more likely they get stored in their memory. Right? If you ask a woman how she's feeling right now, she'll give you a richer description of her feelings than will a man. Right? She'll use more words and there'll be more detail in general in describing the emotional experience of the self. Another area where we see gender differences is in memories about relationships with other people. And again, we see women having kind of a memory advantage here when it comes to relationships. And again, it's probably because of how we view ourselves. Women's self-concept seems to be more strongly related to how they view others and how they view their relationship between themselves and others. Right. So we talk about men having more independent self-construals and women having more interdependent self-construals. So a woman more likely, when asked to define herself, one of the things she might say that would be more likely than for a man to say would be, I'm my mother's daughter. Whereas less likely for a man to say, I'm my mother's son or I'm my father's son. Right? It might be in there, but less likely than for a woman, because woman will, in defining herself, will define herself in relation to others. Whereas the man will more likely say, I'm a postal worker. Right? What I do, not who I am related to other people. So again, that's another gender difference we find in the way that people process information. But again, whenever we talk about gender differences, these are on average. And there are some men who may have more interdependent self-construals than some women, and vice versa. But on average, we see these differences. Okay. Last thing we'll talk about, depression, which we've addressed somewhat already. One thing that is interesting is that for good mental health, misperception seems to be somewhat important. Few people who are happy see the world entirely realistically. Right? They see themselves as better than average in most categories, which is impossible for more than half the people to be better than average. Somebody's got to be below average. And they tend to overestimate the likelihood of success. I think things are going to work out, failing to account for things that might limit their success. But to be happy and mentally healthy, there's a certain amount of arguably self-delusion that occurs. But on the other end of that, some people see the world not necessarily in a realistic way, but in kind of a gloomier than realistic way, more negative, and they tend to be people who have developed well-developed depressive schemas, right? So they have lots of thoughts and feelings related to depression, and a couple aspects of that. One, in terms of the activation of sad thoughts. Whenever you have a well-developed depressive schema, there's lots of sad memories and thoughts and negative thoughts of the self, all connected in that cognitive network. And so whenever you think about one sad thing, which, sometimes something in your environment may cue you to think about some particular sad thing, maybe not even related to yourself, like, oh, that's so sad that that puppy got run over. And all of a sudden, if you have a really strong depressive schema, that little node in the network is going to get activated, and it's going to activate nodes next to it, and so that kind of reminds you of, oh yeah, and I remember losing puppy once, and then you have this kind of progressive activation to where eventually you're remembering and thinking about some of the worst times in your life and how bad you feel, and not because some puppy got ran over, but because that depressive schema got activated, right? So there's lots of lots of feelers out there, lots of landmines potentially, where one gets activated and the other are going to start blowing up as well. Depressive schema also seem to serve to screen out the positive, right? Again, kind of like with aggression, because you have a well-developed depressive schema, it's easier to process information that's sad, that fits with the schema. It's hard to process information that's inconsistent or discrepant with your schema. That's why probably a few of you can relate to this, but back in the day, we had rotary phones, right? And so people learned to dial these rotary phones, and then when switched to these push-button phones, people when pick up the phones, they had to slow down when dialing. They couldn't dial as fast as they could before, until eventually they sped up. But because there's this new way of interacting with the world was discrepant, they process things more slowly, right? Whereas with things that fit with our schema, we can process it more quickly and we're more automatic. So if you have a well-developed depressive schema, there's information out there. Some's positive, some's negative. The negative stuff, that fits right and easy. The positive stuff, what? No, and then you're moving on. You pick the negative and screen the positive out because it's harder. It takes more cognitive effort to recognize and make sense of the positive. Okay. And we find that happens with people who are depressed. You tell them it's kind of like the glass half full, glass half empty. You did really well in this test. You got 9 right and just 1 wrong. I got 1 wrong. I can't believe I got 1 wrong. I'm so stupid. Right? Instead of, oh, I got 9 right, that's wonderful. Right? So de-emphasizing the positive, emphasizing the negative seems to be related to depressive schema and the experience of depression. Also related to depression is a kind of a negative cognitive style. People who are depressed tend to have a negative cognitive style, and people who have a negative cognitive style tend to be at risk for depression. Right? So these things run both ways. And the negative cognitive style is about 2 things really. One, attributions you make for negative events. We've talked about this before. People with a negative cognitive style tend to make global and stable attributions or explanations for negative events. So something bad happened, it's always going to be that way, and it affects everything. Right? So when you fail one test, well, that's because I fail at everything global, and I will always fail at everything stable. Right? Which, if you think like that, that's going to make you feel worse, right? And when you feel worse, you're more likely to think like that. So again, these things feed on each other. So it's about attributions of bad things that have happened, right? Which again, don't forget, you're screening out the positive already. So screening out the positive, and then when the bad ones happen, you make these attributions that make you feel even worse. And then also things that haven't happened yet, you tend to expect them to be negative, right? So pessimism associated with a negative cognitive style, expecting bad things to happen, which again puts people at risk for depression, and people who are depressed then tend to think more pessimistically. Okay, well, that's all for now. Take care.